world in which we live, and the need to constantly tweak designs, but also constantly be introducing lots of different divergent changes that are happening at the same time in order to deal with the complexity of the change. We, about 10 years ago, started working on a model that can work with organizations that are experiencing complex change, because it became pretty clear that when you do significant designs to change capabilities and to adapt to different conditions and implement new strategies, that you're not really dealing with a change that can be managed as if it has a beginning and an end, but rather you're dealing with lots of changes that are crashing into each other in your environment, and that the infrastructure can become overwhelming, and in and of itself it can really work against the agility that you need to be able to carry out change. So we started puzzling over that problem. The world's more dynamic, and we keep using models that try to sort of tame the complexity we face and manage the change. That this has even gotten much worse now that we know that digitization is here to stay and it's disrupting almost all industries, and that they're going much farther than introducing new designs in order to have carry out strategies, but they're actually developing and putting in place new business models so that they're delivering value in a different way. And the thinking of almost everyone in the organization is going to have to change, as well as the way that they interact with each other. And we started talking in terms of beyond change management, what's needed. That was the way we saw it for a while, and now it's focusing on what you can do to make change happen instead of managing change. That line managers want it now and they want it fast, and they don't want a big, long 19-step process for managing a particular change. They really want it to happen, and the reality is that often you can embark on a change and the environment changes before you even finish it if you follow a really systematic process that has lots of steps and takes a long time, and the things are happening at the same time and they need to be coordinated with each other, and that means that people in the organization really need to be much more knowledgeable about what's going on. So if you go to I'm going to take you to the next slide, which is basically, this is the Bottomline framework that Chris and I have been working on. He's going to cover this in greater depth at the end after Beth has created a real-life situation that she has been dealing with. And basically what it says is you need all these processes going on in your organization simultaneously, and part of the job of change management people is to make sure that these are happening. Awareness is the sensing that we all hear about. Designing is the process of reconfiguring pieces or elements of the organization's design continuously to fit with what you're trying to accomplish. Tailoring is a recognition that what gets designed from the center often doesn't work in a particular situation, and there's going to be ongoing tailoring of the designs and the strategies that are being used in the organization. And monitoring is constantly assessing, is what we're doing working or not. The two key processes from a participation standpoint are in the middle: engagement of people in this, and the organization and the people in it learning. And as I say, Chris will be talking more about that in discussing what Beth presents. We know a lot of models, and each of you uses different models that have been used to manage change. Most of these actually are 30 to 40 years old, and they've stood us in good stead. But when you look at them, they're almost all linear models that suggest you can start a change, you can do all the readiness, you can do all the implementation, you can do all the assessment, and that's insufficient in today's world. It's not unnecessary. There are changes where that's going to be really important to look at. It's not unnecessary. It's that it's not sufficient to describe the change management process that has to go on in an organization, the change implementation, the making change happen, and being dynamic and agile that has to characterize our organizations in today's world. All of those models place great stress on executive leadership. top-down change. Let's figure out what the master plan is, and then let's figure out the pieces and roll it out. Prioritizing risk analysis and mitigation. Let's not do things that cause too much risk, which often means let's not do things that actually allow us to adapt to the disruption that we're experiencing. Carefully planning one-way top-down communication. If you look at the communication in a lot of change processes, it's all carefully planned and edited and gone through approvals and so forth. And it almost all goes top-down, and the issue is how do we make everybody hear this? And then develop extensive playbooks and tools and scripts so we do it in the same way. And this can be viewed either as a help to people who are trying to implement, which is, I think it's intended as that, but it also can be viewed as something that actually constrains how people go about implementation. And by the way, it takes a lot of time to develop all this, and is the change even going to be relevant by the time you start putting it in place? And then how do we govern? And the way we've done this historically is both governing the process with things like Gantt charts and work streams and initiatives and steering teams and so forth, which in many cases means that the change that's going out actually in the operating organization ends up being slower and probably less out of the box than we would like it to be. All of our models of change management are elements of complex transitions in that you wouldn't want to, for instance, put in a new ERP system without having a really good flow of the development of that and the implementation of it and the management of the change. But that's one of many things that's going to be going on. And so you need to start building into the organization the ability within the organization to adapt. Requires active leadership learning and engagement across and within the organization. It's going to take a lot of change leadership throughout the organization, and it's going to take the ability of a unit that says this isn't working for us to figure out what to do about it and modify what's going on in their unit. So building change and the ability to handle it into the fabric of the organization is just as important as having a top-down or a well-defined systematic process for managing a specific change. So just to reiterate that, it can't be managed from the top. And with one of the organizations we studied and worked with, had 30,000 employees, 4 global product lines operating 5 regions. If you look down at that, there were 26 local organizations that needed to be impacted by the change in strategy that they were carrying out. It was going to affect 250 business units at different levels. Each of those had multiple teams, multiple interfaces, lots and lots of interfaces with other units, but also with other people in the organization. That had all of that had to change and be modified to fit with a new way of doing business. It doesn't really take rocket scientists to say with that, you really need energy and self-management from within. You cannot rely on handling all that through a weekly steering team meeting. You can perhaps have a check-in and an identification of where things are off track, but you certainly can't approve those changes in 500 different units and modify them and deal with the dynamics that have to change throughout the organization through a set of top-down processes. So the challenge that we think is happening is keeping the organization pointing in the right direction, keeping people rowing in the same direction, acknowledging and trying where you can to reduce complexity through plan change, but really building in self-regulating aspects into the organization in order to be able to adapt to the disruptive change. If you look at this picture, it simply says, and Chris will pick up on this again, it simply says there are some things that you want to really manage so that they're consistent through the organization, like the operating model, like the business model, the strategy. You want common language, common frameworks. That's all part of creating the context in which the real action occurs, and that's the activity that's in the center of that organization, which is the dynamics in the organization itself. So a way to think about this is if you're in charge of managing complex change or dynamic disruption, whatever you want to call it, you need to put in place the things that are outside of that box to create the context. That's part of your focus. The other part, and we think this has been way underestimated, is to build into the way the organization operates the processes that are in the middle of that green circle. And we have an emphasis on moving, just as an example, from hierarchical control to networks of management of change, from PERT charts to recurring cycles and adaptive cycles, to from events that are planned to routines that are built into the organization, so that when a change occurs, people have a common set of steps that they take to be able to bring this to attention and to actually start working on it and setting up a project team or whatever is necessary, but without a huge amount of bureaucracy, because it becomes a process built into the organization. And from refreezing at the end of a change to ongoing agility and ongoing change. Just one last thought that Chris and I have been working on and will continue is that you can almost think of change capability as a maturity progression for an organization. Not a capability that exists in an OE department, but a maturity progression for the organization as a whole. I'm not going to, this is an eye test, but it's not meant to be. All I want to point out with this is that we feel you really have to think about what the organizational effectiveness type professionals, the change management people, the org design people, et cetera, need to be able to do to manage this more complex space, that there's a set of other designer/change enablers that are often left out of change management, the Six Sigma people, the communications people, and so forth, and that line managers themselves are going to have to become fairly independent of professional OE support through their experience and their own education, their own exposure to what's going on in the organization, through working with OE professionals and starting to internalize and being able to adaptively use the frameworks of change and agility in the organization. So that's a heavy remit for an organization, but we really have trouble seeing how you can react to the ongoing discontinuous change that is going to have to be faced in organizations today. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Beth Gunderson, who has been a long-term friend of CEOs. She has been at General Mills, and they have been great supporters of our change and design activities. But much more importantly, she has led a process of building these kind of capabilities into General Mills and has a lot of experience applying this, and has, in the last 5 or 6 years, been coping at General Mills with the extreme disruption in the foods industry, the processed foods industry in particular in this case, and is joining our team at CEO in our design and change activities going forward. So welcome, Beth, and Alice, please turn it over to her.
Thanks, Sue.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So hello to everyone online. I think I sit here at General Mills challenged with many of the same disruptions that you are seeing in your industry. And so as Sue said, the last 5 or 6 years, the context in which we've operated has changed extensively, so has required us to attempt to move from more of an episodic change approach to more of this continuous change. So let me give you some of that context. This is just an overview of General Mills. We are sold around the world. We have 39,000 employees, and what you maybe don't realize is that we are one of the largest makers of natural and organic foods in the U.S., which has been part of the disruption. And you can see here a number of our brands. Some probably look very familiar, and hopefully you have many of them in your pantry or refrigerator. Many maybe don't look familiar. They are sold around the world, and they are specific brands in other locations. But our industry, like I'm sure many of your industries, is being disrupted by a variety of things. And in the food industry, you can see here it's been a lot on acquisitions, some that made very good sense, but some, like the Amazon and Whole Foods, that is really outside the realm of what we would have even considered 5 years ago. We've also had attitudes around food that are changing, and this was an interesting slide that I had put together probably 3-4 years ago, and most of the pictures that I used were things like what you see in the center, the war on big food, small upstarts like Chobani yogurt coming into the marketplace. But even in this last 12 to 24 months, it's not just been about the type of food, but the way in which you get food. So delivery. So the whole e-commerce, the whole door-to-door delivery has changed dramatically. So basically the retailer is just one of our channels that we need to consider. And then you as consumers, you can probably equate to a lot of the things I'm putting up here right now, is that our tastes have changed. So from an organization perspective, our ability to change and react when most of our cycles of creating new products and designing and getting them to market, the types of employees that we hired, the places that we went to hire people, all that we've had to relook at and think about how do we go to market. So if I pull up the star, which hopefully many of you are familiar with, and this is the graphic depiction that we use at General Mills. I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about a travel around the star and the changes that are occurring at General Mills. So one of the first things we needed to do was clarify our strategies and the places that we wanted to play. And what we identified were some key capability gaps, not surprisingly e-commerce, strategic pricing, and then also moving away from a very segmented organization where we had a defined international structure and we had a defined U.S. structure with respective functions supporting each of those. We needed to look more to globalize our structure. And then we also identified some key work processes requiring transformation. And from there, we moved to structure, and we now have, as of a year ago, we've moved away from these defined international division and U.S. division to regions of the world, and we've begun globalizing our functions. And then we've also started to create some standalone capability teams around things like e-commerce and pricing. From a process perspective, we are on the journey to implement some key global processes. So for us, that's very different in that we had the way the U.S. did it and we had the way it was done outside the U.S. We've now identified key processes that will be standard and followed around the world. And we've also globalized our performance and reward scheme. I won't even get into the details, but just share with you that many of you on the call, probably from a performance management perspective, have a 3-point or 5-point or maybe at the most 7-point scale to manage performance. We had a variety of different programs, and I will tell you in the U.S., we utilized a 42 to 43 level rating scale. So I give you that context just to tell you how complicated it has been to go to a now 5 landing spot performance management system and a consistent reward scheme around the world. So how does that impact our people practices? We've had to redefine the role of manager of people. So we've been very clear to our managers around the world on how they do their role as a manager and what they do. We've been enabled by technology where we've just a couple weeks ago launched Workday around the world, as well as 5 global service centers to enable that work. But it has not been without a lot of, as many of you know who've gone through these transformations, without its challenges. And as part of that, we've been transforming all of our people processes. So we've identified 40 global HR processes that will now be consistent. And then we're increasing our external hires at senior levels. So we are buying capabilities. Many of companies, I'm sure you on the phone are like General Mills, we have been a grow from within organization. But with all the disruption that we are seeing, we don't have time to build, say, for example, strategic pricing capabilities. So we've gone out and brought that inside of the organization. So these are just a couple of the key things as we think about what are the changes occurring at General Mills around the star. if you look at then how we are structured, across the top we now have these regions of the world, and we have a global convenience and food service organizations. The functions down on the right-hand side are now global, and then we've built some of these global capabilities. So then let's just take a look at, and this is going to be a total eye chart, and the only thing I want you to pay attention to is all the blue. If any of you are familiar with APQC, these are the consistent value stream processes that any organization would have. So I lay this out as a framework that we use to say, let's figure out which are these key boxes that we need to make change within. And so the next slide is going to show you from a color-coded perspective the number of initiatives that we have going across our enterprise value stream. So again, no need to pay attention to all the boxes, but I want to show you the difference between, this is the basic chart, and then we said, let's overlay all the changes that we are embarking upon. And this is what it looks like. So you can see our organization is experiencing massive change. On the left-hand side, those are the key process or the key projects. The titles of the projects aren't relevant for you at this point, but what I want you to understand is that we have major change going on. And I would say if we were doing this 5 years ago, and most definitely if we were doing this 10 years ago, each of these boxes would have a separate change initiative, and they would be done in boxes. They would be done on discrete activities. But if you think about from an employee perspective, they see these as just one major initiative. And let me just explain first. These are some of the key initiatives that we're working on. And again, the titles may sound familiar to things that you're doing out in your organization. For us, these are the ones that we are formally tracking. There are many more going on, as I'm sure there are in your organization. But surprise, surprise, employees see these separate changes as one tsunami wave hitting them. So the days of having totally discrete change activities, change teams, while important, they need to be stitched together. And so how do we do that without showing up as separate actions? From an employee perspective, they don't care if I'm working on HR transformation and Workday, because they're also seeing other changes. If they're an R&D scientist, they're seeing us change their spec system. They're seeing us change the way we source vanilla, the way we source cocoa, because we're now having a global sourcing organization. So what we took a look at is we said we need to think about this from an enterprise perspective. And this is actually an infographic we put together quite some time ago for our employees to say that we are looking at standardizing and simplifying across the organization. And so we need you to change your mindset and reframe your focus on how to standardize. How do we create governance so that we don't continue to reinvent across the organization? And it's all about the business impact. So the way I wanted to frame this up was to give you one of the frameworks that we use in the change course at USC. And it's building routines into your organization. And so I'm going to share just quickly these 3 buckets from this framework about how we're building routines at General Mills to, as Sue said, build change into the fabric of the organization. And as I also want to put a caveat and say that we are in the early stages of building this. We don't have it perfect, but I would say over the last 5 years, we have learned a tremendous amount. So let me talk about the talent and knowledge. So we are looking at our planning and staffing processes. They've been tested about how do we quickly assemble new knowledge and talent. So I'll use an example of this HR transformation work that we've done, is how do we quickly get the right talent in the right place? And one of the learnings that we had is that we, in some cases, took talent that was available, when frankly, we should have posted some of those positions. Because what happened was we got to the second box there, is we needed to develop talent to quickly move the right talent to the right assignments. And for us on our HR transformation, it was moving talent off who wasn't particularly suited to this very intense, very rapid, very agile work. So what we need to start thinking about is how do we staff these projects so that we can quickly move talent in and move talent out depending upon what's needed. And then on that third box, providing transparency to the broader organization about how we're working and why we're selecting the talent that we're selecting. The second routine is around organization design. And we utilize a common org design framework and process, and that is the STAR model. And I would say we've adopted that about 10 years ago, but probably just in the last 5 years have been able to really embed the STAR model across the organization so that from our CEO down, people know the STAR model and can talk about org design beyond just structure. We've also really gotten line leader involvement and accountability. And so we've built in regular routines about checking in on not just the organization, but the evolving strategy. And so how do we need to change our routines to align to that strategy? And we've begun to build some very robust change project management and governance frameworks that will ensure that not only as we're going through these cycles that we've got a repeatable process, that once we come out of that cycle, we've got a governance process that will allow us to sustain those changes. And then we've developed mechanisms for ongoing input, and not just input from above, but input from below and across our now global organization. And then the last one is implementing and learning. So while Sue talked about the challenges of having this methodology and playbook, I would say it is not a static playbook. So we've allowed a very flexible methodology and playbook that can be utilized across our global organization. What we know, as I'm sure you know, is that what works in the U.S. doesn't always work outside the U.S. So how do you build a playbook that has enough consistency that can be leveraged globally, but enough customization, the ability to customize, that to use the tools that will work outside the U.S. We've also developed some mechanisms to share and align and govern the changes as they're happening simultaneously. So as I showed you that AQPC roadmap, how do we build mechanisms that we can stitch all of these together? So as I said, employees don't see these as multiple changes. They see this as a united front, and they understand why the changes are happening across the organization, and they see that as one major step forward to drive business results. We've developed some forms and processes to learn across the organization, and then we're leveraging existing mechanisms to create this shared language. So we're building in the language where we see existing mechanisms. So for example, we just had our mid-year meeting across the organization, and we made sure that the messaging for all of these changes were under a major umbrella, and we call the major umbrella, the tagline is #WorkDifferently. So we talk about this as an enterprise transformation, just not a collection of changes because we thought it would be fun to do all these changes. We are doing them to drive the business. But there are challenges, and I think many of you on the call would be nodding your heads that these are the same challenges that you have, is overcoming mindsets and practices that have been in place for decades. When you have an organization that's had a separate U.S. division and now needs to work across the globe, there are some mindsets about the way we've done things in the U.S. And we've got decision makers who are steeped in the old way of doing things and their way of valuing and deciding. And it's not that it was wrong, it was the way that worked when we were organized differently. And now we have to try to change those mindsets. And all aspects of our organization design and our work process have evolved to fit our previous capabilities. But now when you move to global processes, that has to change. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about change fatigue across the organization. Some of those context changes I shared at the onset here have been occurring over the last 5 to 7 years. So we've been adapting and adjusting over that time frame. So how do we deal with change fatigue? It's been a challenge because one change leads to the next change. And so how do you use that as leverage? How do you continue to build resiliency in your organization when multitude of changes are happening across the enterprise? So just a few key learnings that we've had here is that we've applied the consumer lens that we use in developing our products to how we look at change. And we're putting the employee first. So beyond our traditional stakeholder maps, we're talking more about our consumer, who is our employee. So how do we engage them early and often to get feedback on the changes and how they will be, how they'll hit the organization? I talked about our playbooks and templates. They not only allow for ease of repeatability, but frankly, they also are training our organization on how to accept our changes. So we now have a very repeatable playbook that we use when we implement enterprise changes. So employees are now conditioned to understand through various communication mechanisms, through the same training mechanism about how they are going to get changes delivered and served up to them. And we have learned that we must dedicate trusted, ambitious, and capable talent to lead these overall change efforts, and we have to act quickly on those who may not be suited for this kind of change work. And then once these changes happen, we need to ensure that there is a governance, not just governance methodology, but also people. Governance structure needs to be in place before implementation so that they can hit the ground running. And then calm confidence goes a long way. When you are experiencing organizational change that we are, I can tell you that for a lot of people, this puts their hair on fire. And those of us who are driving these kind of changes have to show up with a high level of calm confidence. And we have to be able to instill that in our key stakeholders as well. And so what's next for us? What's interesting is we've been doing this now on a large scale. Now we're talking about how do we ensure that we can scale this down for some of the smaller changes that we are not tracking at an enterprise level. How do we take this methodology? How do we take the learnings that we've had and share that with others who may be working deeper in the organization? And how do we leverage the investment? So I'll give you an example on this HR transformation project we did. We had about 120 people working on that major initiative. How do we ensure that the investment we've made in those individuals, the learnings they've had around how to do large-scale change, how do we ensure that they take those learnings now and apply them to the other projects that they're working on? And then how do we live it under our hashtag working differently going forward? So I've just given you a snapshot. For those of you that will be coming to the change course that will be happening here in the spring, we'll be talking a lot more about this specific example, but I've given you a kind of a snapshot of what's been going on here, and my hope is that some of this resonates with you. We'll talk much more about the learnings we've had and actually some of the tools we've developed at the Change Workshop coming up. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Beth. Appreciate that piece. And calm confidence. That's easy for you to say, right? Calm confidence. I have to practice that a little bit.
Yeah, it's not easy.
So, as Beth said, this is a pretty big change. That's why we wanted her to talk about it, and it begins to demonstrate some of the issues that Sue introduced at the beginning of the webinar around all these multiple changes taking place, and laying out this really broad set of issues and changes that's going on in General Mills, and then using that as a way to jump into some specifics that we'll talk about in March at the seminar that we're doing. What I wanted to do was try and put a couple of these, put this particular case in some context, and step back just one step on this slide and then step forward on the next slide to think about what Beth just described in terms of her organization and put that in the context of the model that Sue introduced at the beginning. We're talking about change, and on the one hand, change is sort of this difference, right? It was rainy today and it was snowy tomorrow. That's a change in the weather. We can talk about a specific thing that has changed. We've got we were a functional organization, now we're a customer-centric organization, and we can point to that and talk about all the specific things that are different. But there's another side of change, and that's the changes in experience. And we sort of experience change as a kind of a difference between what we thought was going to happen and what actually happened. And I tried to draw that here in the middle, that we all have expectations and beliefs and hopes and concerns about what will happen, and then something actually does happen, and there's a difference between those two things. And that's the experience that we have of change, and that can be positive or negative, right? If the expectation and what actually happens is positive and it goes along with what we expected, then we actually experience that change as progress or growth, and this is a good thing. We don't even actually experience it as change. We see it as a continuation of the way things should be. So, boy, I really deserved that raise because it was a long time coming. It was something that I expected. It actually happened. I experienced that as a relatively good thing. And so not all change is bad. And we don't have any problem adapting to that kind of change. If we don't sense that, we don't feel that as a disruption. But a lot of the changes that Sue talked about and then Beth described, we experience these changes as negative because they're unintended. We're surprised by what happened. What happened doesn't actually align with what we expected. And so these kinds of changes are experienced as disruptive. We see them as a problem. We see them and experience them as instability and uncertainty and ambiguity, and we don't like it, right? There's a lot of, and I think what's happening today is there's a lot more bad change. What we expect and hope is not turning out the way we expect and hope, and we experience that as negative and unintended. Organizations are looking at digitalizing and changing and adapting to the digital trend, and they look at the consumers, which are already there. They're already digital, and now they expect us to adapt to that. And boy, we didn't expect that. That's really different. And so that experience that we have of change and of disruption requires that we begin to change in ways that we didn't plan for or didn't expect. And now we look at change as bad and change as hard. And this number of unintended negative goals, expectations, just keeps getting longer because it's not just a particular change, it's regulatory change and customer change and product change and technological change. And all these things just keep, sort of adding up and piling on. And so the notion becomes, as those of you who know, what Sue and Beth and Becky and I have been playing with over the last few years, is we see this in beginning to adapt to these disruptions. It's requiring an organization that looks at change and looks at each change as an opportunity to learn to be more agile and to think about change as something that's ongoing. It's continuously discontinuous. It's complex. It's simultaneous change that's happening all the time, and that's this genesis of the kind of model that Sue then brought up in what we're doing. And so if I borrow kind of Sue's and adapt the model, the slide that Sue used earlier, we can now look at the General Mills change, and I think this is a story about reaping what you sow, about leveraging a set of investments that allow the organization to take these specific disruptions and sort of, do something with them that's productive. So rather than the generic set of changes that Sue listed in hers, I've tried to list some of the things that Beth talked about. She talked about an HR transformation taking place involving several hundred people. She talked at the beginning of her presentation about industry, customer, and attitudinal changes, some of which are continuations of old trends, some of which are seen and perceived and felt as disruptive. She showed us the AQPC, the value chain thing there, and shifted the colors to show us all the different initiatives within the value stream and across the value stream that we're changing. She talked a little bit about the Workday implementation, the new global organization, and the adoption of some common design change frameworks that the organization, has started to use and build into its vocabulary and its capability from the CEO on down. And so with all of these changes taking place, we just don't see traditional models being able to handle all that complexity. So we adapted, Sue and I put our heads together and started saying, what are we seeing? What do we know about agility? And then the design that's associated with organizations that are able to change in a timely and effective way, with the change management models that are sort of look only at specific changes and treat them as projects that are going to have a beginning of an end. And that's where we came up with the engage and learn model. Each of the changes that Beth described requires a certain amount of awareness. You have to be aware of what's happening externally in the industry, consumer, and attitudinal changes. But you also have to be aware of what's happening internally inside the organization. The people in the organization, as Beth described it, don't experience this as 17 different changes. It's just one massive tsunami that's going over them. And if you're a leader of change, or if you're an OE or HR organization that's being tasked with managing and leading change in the organization, you have to be aware of all of this, both internally and externally, what's happening. Because if you don't see the connections and can't help people connect the dots, their experience of this is not only going to be disruptive, negative, and unintended, it's going to be debilitating. Beth talked about, change fatigue. I think when people see change as a project and they think it's going to be over, and then another change comes along and another change comes along, and they have no way of seeing all those changes as being interconnected, we end up with change fatigue and people are just overwhelmed, okay? Each of these changes requires some understanding and awareness of design. The way you think about designing a project is very different than the way you think about designing a global organization. It's very different about how you think about designing a HR transformation or designing a Workday implementation process. So what we see is organizations have to really amp up their capabilities and their awareness and understandings of different organization designs. We just can't slap a functional structure on this project, on that initiative, on this emerging market organization. Each one of those is going to have to apply and utilize and leverage a specific kind of design knowledge. And so we think organizations that are going to involved in continuous and continuous discontinuous change are going to have to just really amp up their knowledge and an understanding of the alternatives, the alternative ways that you can do design. I think Beth's presentation really highlights the importance of tailoring. She talked about needing to work differently in the global functions. She talked about the organization taking on a different mindset, whether it's hashtag work differently, or designing something that at the local level, whether it's in China or a European organization or the U.S. organization. Each of these changes, each of the workday implementation steps is going to have to be thought through in terms of how it's going to land in different cultures, in different regions, in different functions. And you know, Sue's description of all those interfaces that are going to take place as a large, complex organization changes, I think really points to the importance of this tailoring effort. Can you look at execution and implementation of any particular change as being customized and fit to the particular situation that it's facing? And then we have to start thinking about ways of monitoring things, figuring out ways to test, understand, keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the organization, so that we can quickly listen to all these different parts of the organization and the extent to which they are, you know, accepting the change, working with the change, whether the change is on track, and whether they're producing. At the sponsors conference last May, Joe Whittinghill from Microsoft talked about how Microsoft is pulsing their organization on a daily basis to understand how different changes and announcements in the media and announcements by senior management are being felt in the organization. Pulsing on a daily basis, sampling in the organization so that they can understand quickly how people are hearing and thinking about and understanding what's happening in their culture change that's being led by Satya and Kathleen Hogan in the HR organization. So I think all of these things, I think Beth's presentation sort of helps us look at all these pieces of the model. And as I started this slide, I said, remember, I think this is a story about reaping what you sow and leveraging an investment. Because I think as you listen to what Beth was saying, not only was her organization engaging in these changes, they had learned from these changes. They had put in some common change and org design frameworks 5 and 10 years ago. And the way and I know she's going to talk about this more in March, the way that workday implementation happened, how they partnered with some external consultants and used those external consultants' understanding of workday, but also used an understanding of the way General Mills changes. They leverage this capability to make changes and to make design. And many of these changes are disruptive and unintended, but these common design frameworks and these common concepts and language and capabilities that she's built inside this organization has allowed them to sort of fold all these things together. And I think that's really the real strong message here, is they've made an investment in design, they've made an investment in change capabilities, and now she's able to take all these different disruptions and begin to think about a way of orchestrating them. And I think that's really the kind of the capabilities that Sue and I really are starting to get and trying to get organizations to think about as they learn to adapt to these disruptions, so that the next time another disruption comes at General Mills, that one's going to be a little easier than maybe the first few were. And that's kind of the model we're hoping organizations begin to think about and adopt. And on that point, I'll stop. We've got about 10 minutes or so, and we can grab some questions from the audience here and see how people are thinking about some of the things that Sue and Beth and I talked about. What kinds of questions show up for you? And go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we'll try and address them. And have there been some questions before here that we can address?
Yeah, there are a couple there. Yes. And then so we did unmute everyone to make this an open question and answer the last 10 minutes. But if you're not going to speak, please keep your phones muted. And there are two questions here. There's
right now there's a lot of background noise. We have to see if we can get rid of that.
Unmute everybody again.
Yeah. We may have to mute and raise hands. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Sorry
unmuting,
about
I'll put you guys back on. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris, the major, and Beth, the major question that's come out so far is about, and I think playbooks are pretty specific to specific changes that are being put in. People want to know if they can get shared and if we're going to teach them the workshops and so forth. I think we need to sort of clarify what we can and can't do there.
Yeah, and I would say in March I will talk more about the. A lot of background noise.
Yeah, Alice, mute everybody again, please.
Okay, hold on. Sorry. I got me. Okay. Yeah, fine. Then I gotta. Okay.
That's much better.
Okay, that's better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I talk about the playbook, I want to be clear that when I say playbook, it's not just a hard copy document of something. It's really how we approach enterprise change. So it includes involving, we call them, I'm going to use the HR transformation as an example. We called out a group of HR business partner leads in every one of our regions and functions. And we had a cycle of meetings with that group to keep them up to date, and then they were our executors out in the regions. The playbook also includes an electronic, literally a document that had all of the materials that they would need, but what I'll talk about in March is a bit more about how we allowed for customization and how we figured out what the nuances were across the globe. And so we now have a full sense of, we've segmented our employees into, we've got about 48 different employee segments. And when I say segments, it's literally like a consumer segment. I'll give you an example. We've got 1,200 employees in Brazil who are merchandisers. They literally stock the shelves with product. Many of those individuals can't read, but 100% of them do not have smartphones or computers. So how do we reach that employee segment? So we've segmented all our employees. So now those segments can be used for other change projects. Because for any project going on, any kind of change initiative, we have to communicate to our employees. So now we've created this playbook that has our 48 employee segments. So I'll talk more about the specifics. So I want to be clear though, when I say playbook, it's very holistic. And it's actually kind of a way of working when we are faced with a multitude of changes.
Yeah, and might you also, Beth, have playbooks? I think that's what comes to people's mind for specific initiatives, or do you call that something else?
Yeah. So yeah. I can. Then we would have, we call them toolkits within the. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So I'll share more about that in March.
I had a thought, and that was around change fatigue. And Chris, I think you picked up on this a little bit, which is I think that the transition that we are in the middle of is to start seeing change as the work and not get fatigued by change because you see that as what you're there to be doing.
Right.
And that's a huge transition. In our work where we are dealing with a dynamic digital organization, there is one viewpoint that the people that will remain in an organization are the ones who can actually see the management of that transition as what they're there to do, and not say, oh, I'm so tired because they're asking me to do all this change, but say, wow, they've hired me because I can help lead the organization through this complex transition. And that's a really big change. Have you run into anybody talking about that kind of flavor change, either Chris or Beth? Yeah, Beth.
Yeah, we've, you know, in an organization where it's where people grew up here, the rapid change that's occurring is very unusual for us. And what's been interesting is, as we hire more people from the outside, it's almost they're coming from organizations where this has been a given. So it's been an interesting dynamic where we are leveraging some of our newer employees to sort of share what's going on outside our four walls, and that has helped. I also want to pick up on one of these other questions I see here about how do you help HR adapt and move forward with the new role. This has been a really fascinating one, and I'll draw on the HR transformation that we've done. For no fault of their own, our HR function was frankly has been probably the most difficult to get through the change because we had to bring them on early. And it was their roles have changed dramatically. So we've done a number of things. One, just I'll share with you off the cuff, is we created a recontracting guide for them. And we really dug into what do you need to stop, start, continue, or transfer as an HR business partner as part of transformation. And then they literally have to go meet with their line clients and recontract what their job is. So we've given them a template to do that. We've spent a day with our HR business partners around the world getting them prepped to do that. And now we're giving them between now and like early March to have those recontracting. So that in of itself is starting to help us shift the mindset of, in this case, our HR function.
The other thing I'd say about the change fatigue piece is, one, I think it's part of the change in moving from thinking about. I've got too many change words in the same sentence. One of the things that's changing is that we're moving from a view of change as a project to change as a continuous thing. Mm-hmm. And when you think about change as a project, then people think change will be over. Yeah. And when people think change that will be over and it's not over, they feel betrayed. Mm-hmm. And that betrayal and you know is really, it's a tough thing because people want to know that or have set an expectation. Right, we're back to this experience again. Have set an expectation that they get a chance to rest, because they think change is not the normal thing you're supposed to do. But I like the way Sue was putting it. We have to reframe everything and start sending expectations to people that change is what's normal and stability might be sort of the odd thing. And if you're expecting change, I don't think, and you can check this with your own experience, if you're just expecting change to be what's happening, you're not surprised and you're not fatigued by it so much. I think you could be overwhelmed by it, but I don't think you're fatigued by it so much. I was working with a French company here, and you know, I was working with them today, and they were talking about, we have to go faster. And I said, wait a minute, you guys wanted to go really slow while you were going through the change. And now that you've been through the change and you sort of had all the learnings, now you want everybody else to go fast. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's going to work. So setting these expectations about learning and how it happens and allowing people to have the time to engage and learn and absorb, and then understanding how to accelerate that. So that's where the conversation shifted to, is when did you guys start to learn fast about what you were going through? And this is the research that we've done at the center, and Sue was leading. When you get them in conversation with other people who are also trying to make sense, they learn faster. When you learn faster, you change faster. When you have conversations with people about what's going on, you don't feel alone. And I think that set of expectations in reality starts to happen easier and mitigate some of this change fatigue kind of issue.
And for those who are still on the phone, this actually relates to the last question, which was, you noticed that on the maturity curve we put down for line managers, we didn't put this down. This is actually done with a company that's actually got its own maturity curve that it's been developing with us. attending workshops, that's code for getting them to step out of their day-to-day, I deliver this and I can't even deliver till midnight because I'm so busy in so many meetings, et cetera. Getting them to step out of that and have these conversations that will allow them to reframe how they think about what they're doing. And, you know, there's a very, very fundamental finding in the whole field of org change, org development, and learning, which is you can't learn if you don't take time to reflect. So workshops is code for bringing people together, getting them to talk about what they're working on and reflecting on it, and figuring out how to rethink about what their job is in the organization. I agree with the comment that sending everybody to school doesn't really, not only doesn't it work, it isn't really realistic in today's world, but having these conversations around real work that's going on and how we can do it differently is absolutely essential to dealing with the dynamic change under this whole model that right now is on your screen in the middle.
Well, I hope a lot of you on the call are coming to the workshop because we've got, looks like a lot of similar challenges
exactly.
in these questions, so we could certainly dive deeper and talk much more about them.
Yeah. Thanks, Beth, for joining us and being with us.
Thanks,
and,
Beth.
Thanks to all of those who participated in the webinar. We, as I say, we rely on the kindness of friends, but also we nurture one another, we feel, and we get a lot of information and good ideas from everybody we deal with and hope to share those with you.
Thanks everybody, for coming out.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.